Hello, my name is Erin Herzog. I work for the Vermont Community Broadband Board, also known as the VCBB, which is the state of Vermont's office responsible for broadband access and digital equity. The VCBB has recently released some important draft policies to guide our strategy to ensure universal access to broadband in the state of Vermont, and we'd like your feedback. In 2021, the United States Congress passed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which includes historic investment to ensure that all U.S. residents have access to reliable, high-speed, and affordable broadband. This funding is administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, through two programs, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program, and the Digital Equity Act program. These are collectively referred to as Vermont's Internet for All plans. Today I'll focus on the BEAD program, which will provide almost $229 million of funding to the state of Vermont to ensure universal broadband access and advance digital equity. Some of the language is technical as written by the federal government. Please bear with me as I use these terms to be as accurate as possible in describing our drafts and how they fit into the overall project. The VCBB is responsible for developing Vermont's strategy and implementation plans. We have just released some important BEAD planning documents for public comment, the BEAD 5-year action plan, as well as Volume 1 of the initial proposal for how Vermont will administer its BEAD funds. This presentation will describe those documents. Here's what I'll cover: an overview of Vermont's Internet for All plans, a summary of the draft BEAD 5-year action plan out for public comment, a summary of the BEAD initial proposal Volume 1 out for public comment, and describe next steps as Vermont finalizes preparation for and receives its Internet for All funding. This presentation also does not include Vermont's Digital Equity Plan, which will also be publicly released later this fall. It's important to note that the two documents I'll describe in the presentation are just part of a broader set of components for Vermont's BEAD program. The first two components are Vermont's 5-year action plan and a subset of its initial proposal called Volume 1. The 5-year action plan and initial proposal are the first deliverables to unlock Vermont's access to its BEAD funding allocation. Vermont will develop its initial proposal in two parts, Volume 1 and Volume 2. The table here outlines what's included in each. In summary, the 5-year action plan is Vermont's vision and strategy for broadband equity access and deployment. The initial proposal is the proposed process for how Vermont will administer its BEAD grant program. Volume 1 of the initial proposal includes eligible locations and community anchor institutions, as well as the proposed challenge process. Volume 2 will contain more detail on the grantee selection process. The process to get to the point of releasing funds and implementing BEAD subgrants in Vermont begins with the 5-year action plan, then the initial proposal, followed by the challenge process and subgrantee selection, and lastly, the final proposal. Today, we're at the beginning with the draft 5-year action plan and Volume 1 of the initial proposal out for public comment. After public comment, we will finalize and submit those two deliverables to NTIA for approval. NTIA did not require a public comment period for the 5-year action plan, but VCBB believes in the importance of Vermonters' participation in shaping such important programs. The public comment period will last until August 2nd, after which we'll finalize the plan for submission by NTIA's deadline of August 28th. NTIA requires a 30-day public comment period for the volumes of the initial proposal. Comments on Volume 1 must be submitted by August 18th. VCBB plans to submit Volume 1 to NTIA in mid-September. The drafts are available on the VCBB website. Initial proposal Volume 2 will be submitted to NTIA later this fall. Once NTIA has approved its initial proposal and 5-year action plan, Vermont will begin the state challenge process. The challenge process refines what locations are eligible for BEAD-funded network deployment. The subgrantee selection process will be a competitive subgrant process for proposals to expand broadband access to the eligible unserved and underserved locations. The details of this process will be described in Volume 2. The final proposal will document VCBB's selection of projects to fund. Now, just a little bit more context to keep in mind as you listen to this presentation and review the drafts. First, remember these are drafts and they will continue to evolve with your input before being finalized and submitted to NTIA. Second, please remember that this is a point-in-time snapshot. Data included in these documents reflect information available at the time they were written. Examples of this include the funding inventory, unserved and underserved locations, and public survey data. These numbers can change daily. Third, the criteria and process for subgrantee selection is not included in these drafts. It'll be described in Volume 2, which will be released for public comment later this summer. And lastly, this is focused on building out the infrastructure so that every Vermonter can access affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband if they choose to. Vermont's Digital Equity Plan, which will be released in the fall, will go into much greater detail on how Vermont plans to address other barriers to internet adoption, such as internet affordability, device availability and affordability, and digital skills. Now, I'll present a summary of the draft BEAD 5-year action plan. This document describes Vermont's vision and strategy for universal high-speed broadband access in the state. It has two audiences. One audience, importantly, is you, Vermonters. We at VCBB are public servants serving you, and this plan is intended to ensure the BEAD program benefits all Vermonters, especially those most affected by the digital divide. The other audience is the NTIA. This plan is one of the required deliverables that must be approved by NTIA in order to release the BEAD funds for Vermont. Vermont's vision for broadband equity, access, and deployment is that all Vermonters have universal access to reliable, high-quality, affordable fixed broadband of speeds of at least 100 by 100 megabits per second, and that all Vermonters and institutions have the tools and skills to maximize the value internet connectivity can offer. This 5-year action plan outlines how Vermont can achieve this vision, what its current state is, the state's needs and gaps, and its plan for action. Vermont's goals are to mobilize resources for end-to-end broadband infrastructure deployments to all unserved and underserved locations and community anchor institutions, CAIs, in Vermont, ensure sustainable, community-driven solutions across the entire state, ensure high-speed broadband services and devices are affordable and advance digital equity for all Vermonters, enhance workforce development for broadband and the digital economy, and improve socioeconomic conditions across Vermont. In the 5-year action plan, we describe Vermont's current state of broadband access, deployment, adoption, affordability, and digital equity. This includes assets as well as needs and gaps. For example, approximately 20% of households lack access to 100 over 20 megabits per second or better broadband connectivity. Approximately 23,000 Vermont households have access to the internet but cannot afford it, yet only 17% of households eligible for the Affordable Connectivity Program have enrolled in it. And according to a survey we conducted during the plan development process, most people say they have access to a computer and feel confident in their digital skills. For each of the goals, we defined indicators of success. We designed these indicators to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timely, and also ambitious. For example, by December 31st, 2028, we seek to have 100% of currently unserved and underserved on-grid locations with access to 100 by 100 megabits per second broadband, and 100% of currently unserved and underserved off-grid locations with access to 100 by 20 megabits per second broadband. We seek to have 100% of internet service providers that receive funding from Vermont's BEAD program with documented, meaningful community support, such as a partnership with a communications union district. By the end of 2028, we want to see 20% of all Vermont households with a fixed broadband subscription, 60% of eligible households signed up for a broadband service subsidy, like the Affordable Connectivity Program, and 95% of households have a device, such as a laptop or desktop computer. The VCBB also plans to monitor changes in socioeconomic conditions. We didn't define specific numerical targets for these since it's hard to prove causation between broadband and socioeconomic conditions, but we do see correlation and want to be intentional about tracking such impact on economic, health, and educational outcomes. Vermont has been allocated $228.9 million under the BEAD program. Including its BEAD allocation, the state has approximately $394.1 million in existing funding that's available for extending high-speed broadband infrastructure to unserved and underserved locations and community anchor institutions. While all addressable, Vermont faces three main categories of issues in implementing its BEAD plan. Institutional, such as serving historically marginalized and difficult to reach populations, ensuring CUDs have capacity to deploy networks and can provide affordable service in a commercially sustainable way. Legal, such as balancing compliance with federal statutory requirements to conduct an open and competitive subgrantee selection process while staying true to the municipal CUD structures and community-driven vision of Act 71. And economic, including supply chain challenges and labor shortages, tracking and maximizing all available sources of broadband funding, limited funding coupled with Vermont's challenging terrain and low population density. The 5-year action plan is due to NTIA by the end of August. The initial proposal, Volume 1, will follow in September and Volume 2 in November. Once Volume 1 is approved and Volume 2 is submitted, Vermont can begin its challenge process for locations eligible for BEAD funding. Once Volume 2 is submitted, Vermont can begin its subgrantee selection process. We anticipate being able to start releasing BEAD funding at the end of next year. The estimated cost of extending fiber to Vermont's approximately 50,000 unserved and underserved locations, excluding RDOF-funded locations, is $500 to $700 million. We are confident that BEAD, ARPA, subgrantee matches, and other funding sources will cover this cost. There are three important variables underpinning this: the cost of extending end-to-end fiber connectivity to each unserved and underserved location in the state, the amount of matching funds that will be offered by prospective BEAD subgrantees, and the amount of funds that the state will set aside to cover any cost overruns or encourage subgrantees to include in their proposed budgets. Lastly, I'd like to mention our appreciation for the extensive public engagement as we drafted these plans. We intentionally sought to offer several different types of engagement to reach all kinds of Vermonters, and we saw great participation. The input we received helped shape these drafts. Your continued feedback will help us improve them for the final version. Now, turning to the initial proposal, we have released the draft of Volume 1 for public input. The initial proposal explains how Vermont intends to administer BEAD subgrants, challenge process, eligibility requirements, scoring criteria, and ensure that every resident has access to a reliable, affordable, high-speed broadband connection. Volume 1 is part of the initial proposal. Volume 2 will be shared for public comment later this summer. Volume 1 outlines existing efforts funded by the federal government or the state of Vermont to deploy broadband and close the digital divide, the identification of each unserved and underserved location within the state of Vermont, Vermont's definition of community anchor institutions and identification of all eligible community anchor institutions, and Vermont's proposed challenge process. These are illustrative maps of locations eligible for BEAD funding. The data will be updated with a new release from the FCC before the final Volume 1 is submitted to NTIA. Under the BEAD program, a key priority is ensuring all community anchor institutions have access to 1 gigabit symmetrical broadband service. The VCBB has adopted NTIA's list of community anchor institutions, including schools, libraries, workforce development agencies, health facilities, public housing, and more. VCBB also added houses of worship, correctional facilities, and juvenile detention centers, public outdoor spaces such as parks, and public access television station facilities. As part of its effort to ensure a transparent and fair grant process, the VCBB is required to conduct a challenge process for eligible locations for BEAD funding. This is different from the FCC challenge process many Vermonters help participate in. The VCBB will release data on eligible locations and community anchor institutions. Challenges will be submitted through an online portal and will be visible to the internet service provider whose service is being challenged to allow for a rebuttal. The VCBB will then review and make final determinations on challenges and submit the result to NTIA for approval. As a reminder, we're accepting comments on the 5-year action plan up until August 2nd and comments on Volume 1 up until August 18th. Comments can include anything, for example, suggestions of additional community anchor institutions or your opinion on whether the plan's goals sound realistic. You can email your comments to vcbb.info@vermont.gov, write to VCBB 112 State Street, Montpelier, Vermont 05620, or call 800-622-4496. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to your feedback.